Single mom, 2 kids, one 15, one 13, still paying off her student loans from when she got her bachelor's degree to become a nurse, so she could work at the hospital that's just a few blocks away where she walks every day. Her kids, both boys, are walking to the high school that's also just a few blocks away in the opposite direction. The house isn't great. It's more than 100 years old. They've lived there for 6. But it costs less than $1,000 a month, and it works for them. She has a car, but it's unreliable, so she only uses it on the weekend. Until she gets a letter in the mail that says in 90 days, when her lease is up, she's got to get out. The house is going to be torn down and be replaced with an apartment building. So she starts her search, looking for another apartment or a house in the same neighborhood so she can keep walking to work and her boys can keep walking to school. But they discover that if they want to stay in the same neighborhood, they're going to spend at least another $300 or $400 a month, or they can move 15 minutes away and she's got to buy a real car. So a few years ago, I worked for an organization that was statewide, and I covered the region here in West Michigan. And my job was to incentivize development. We were measured on a few things. We were measured on how many jobs we create, how much additional private investment we catalyze, and how many buildings we rehab that are historic. I was very excited to have this job. It was a great job. I loved the whole time that I was there. I loved all the people that I worked with. And throughout my time there, and probably for a period of time long before this, I had imposter syndrome, right? Where no matter how much I thought I knew, I never felt like I knew enough. And no matter how much other people thought I might know, I always was afraid that one day they'd figure me out, and I didn't really know that much. So I got this job, and previous to that, I had been a town planner and thought a lot about theories of cities, but didn't really know how to execute on anything. So I get this job, and I've got to learn how to finance development. My job was to bring resources to projects that couldn't quite make it financially and make them work. So I got this crash course in how do you develop buildings, and how do you finance them, and how do you know when there's a gap, and when there is a gap, how do you fund it without giving them too much money? So for a year, I drank from a fire hose and slowly began to figure it out. And eventually, I became really good at it. Eventually, over the course of 4 or 5 years, I helped to incentivize more than $250 million worth of projects, more than 75 buildings across West Michigan, leveraged about $75 million in state incentives to get these buildings done. And they were great projects. Pretty much every one of them I'm really excited about and still drive by and point out to my kids and say, I helped with that. But just as I started to get really good, and frankly, I would get competitive with my team members, and it felt good to be able to say that I was leading the team, that I was producing more than anybody else in the group. And I really kind of needed that positive feedback for my ego. It was important. But about 2.5 years in, I started to realize that some of the work we were doing was having negative consequences in the neighborhoods we were investing in. We were measuring ourselves based on private investment leveraged and jobs created. We were not measuring ourselves based on the number of people displaced, or based on the level of affordability or the increase in quality of life. Those weren't factors. However, everybody I worked with, top to bottom in this organization, cared about all of those things. We all thought those things were important, but we didn't measure them. So they didn't show up on a scorecard. We never elevated them to the legislature or the governor's office. And so 3.5 years in, I started to talk to my supervisor to say, hey, I think some of this stuff that we're doing is having negative consequences. We should think about this. We should find other ways of operating. Why don't we spend more time really working with the local community to find ways to solve for these issues so that we don't have single moms who are getting pushed out of their houses and then pushed out of the neighborhood, and then their kids get pushed out of the schools. And my supervisor was great, super empathetic, really listened and said, I know, this is hard. We can't solve everything, but keep thinking about that. And if you come up with an idea and you have a plan, share it with me. And so I spent a lot of time driving around the state. And when I wasn't thinking about what I had to do that day, about the next meeting, I thought about this problem. How do we solve for those folks? How do we create solutions not only for private investment and jobs created, but also for people who are struggling on the margins, sometimes who are impacted by the projects that we're making to happen? And so I thought about, gosh, what would my plan be? How would I do this? And I would come up with ideas, and some of them I thought these could be good ideas. But our senior leader at the top of the organization was no nonsense. Super great woman, still have a ton of respect and admiration for her. But I knew if I didn't come in with a rock solid plan that I knew how to implement, I was toast, right? She'd say, I don't have time for this. You haven't thought this all the way through. Come back when you've thought more about it. So I didn't want to go to her until I really knew that this was the solution and here's how we would implement it. And so several times I would think through this and I'd think, okay, I'm going to type this up and I'm going to bring it into her office and we're going to have a conversation, or I'm going to bring it up at the next staff meeting and let's talk it through and hash it out. And a month would go by and I wouldn't have executed on that. And then another month would go by and I still wouldn't have done it. And all this time I'm thinking, currently I'm the top producer on the team. And if I change the way that we operate, if I change the way that we think about these projects, am I still going to be able to do that? And I started to put ego over equity. And so every month I would check myself and say, shit, I didn't do that yet. I keep saying I'm going to do it, but I didn't do it. And eventually I started to write a plan, and I drafted the plan, and then I would tweak the plan. But month after month after month went by, and I never said anything.